Crouse.
It's interesting. I've just come from a documentary about the rock band Rush. And in the documentary, they talk a great deal about finding a balance between the technical proficiency that each of these players has, they're all sort of virtuosos, versus making sure that the song is still the most important thing. And it sort of brought to mind, I think anyway, for me, the work that you did on Avatar. Can you tell me a bit about finding a balance between working with very new technology and yet maintaining the storytelling, which, as far as filmmaking goes, is at least 50% of the deal of making a great film?
I think it's the most important factor by far, and you just have to keep that in mind. I mean, I think earlier in my career, I love the visual effects so much. I may have gotten distracted by that a little bit, although I always put a high premium on story. I think that as the films got bigger, it got more difficult to, with the Abyss, let's say, it got more difficult to balance the effects and the spectacle with the emotional component. But I sort of had to go through that growth stage before I got to Titanic. By Titanic, I knew so much in my DNA at that point that the story had to be first and foremost, and all the visual spectacle and visual richness of the film was in support of that. So I kind of had it in balance by then. And then with Avatar, it was kind of second nature, which is not to say that it's easy. And I would say one of the biggest challenges of Avatar was staying kind of fresh to the storytelling as a filmmaker over a 4.5-year period, especially in the last 6 months or so of editing the film, where I was so close to the fabric of the film every day that I don't want to say I was trying to get numb to it, but it got harder and harder to be objective and to create in my mind how the audience would respond, never having seen it before.
Right, well, David Cronenberg's told me that in his earlier films, when he was in the editing room, he was so familiar with the story that he would say, oh, people will understand that. If I take this out, people won't miss it. And then he says that, as a result, his first couple of films are almost incomprehensible now because he took out too much. That sort of explains some of his movies, actually. I get that. No, you do. You become very familiar with your own story to the point. Look, I believe I have a pretty good mechanism for constantly saying, how's the audience supposed to know that? Right. How are they supposed to be grounded in this moment? But, conversely, I've also found that you can be a little too repetitious with concepts and the audience could jump ahead of you. And if that happens, that's a problem as well. For the audience to be too far ahead of you, okay, I get it already. Move on. You don't want that response either. And carefully modulating that response is a very difficult thing. I always work with at least one other editor on Titanic and Avatar. I worked with two other editors, and we were a 3-person team. I was, an editor equal in terms of responsibilities to them. We'd cut scenes and then give them to each other to think about or re-edit and so on. And so it was really a group dialogue. I think that's a critical part of it. You've got to have that dialogue. Well, are you a believer in test screenings or no?
I think you learn a lot from a test screening if you know how to use it. We were a little bit worried about it on Avatar because we didn't, it was so under wraps. I mean, it really was a Manhattan project. So we did what I like to think of as closely held test screening, where we got, because Fox is a big organization, so we got, secretaries and friends and family, spouses of Fox employees to come in. And, we did cards. And we did a couple of those, and we learned a lot about the film from that. I think it could be valuable.
Well, John Landau told me that he knew that it was going to be a hit, or at least he felt it was going to be, when Steven Spielberg came to one of these and said, "You've hit it. You've made it. You've made a great film here." When did you know that Avatar was probably going to be an enormous hit?
I don't know if I knew it until it was really out there. I had a suspicion that the film would perform beyond what its opening weekend would indicate. I felt that our challenge was not the film itself as much as the marketing of the movie. We didn't have Brad Pitt, George Clooney. We didn't, it was an unfamiliar story. We had to create a brand from scratch. there were a lot of marketing hurdles, and we had these characters that were blue and were maybe a little off-putting when people first saw them. I was much more worried about the 30-second TV spot than I was about how the film played. I knew the film played fine, so I sort of felt that we wouldn't really know where we were until the second or maybe even the third weekend. Now, normally a movie's all done but the crying by the third weekend, but I felt that we were going to hang in there, and our strategy was to release on December 18th, which is the same date we had for Titanic. We knew we would be relatively unopposed in the marketplace for at least a month. So if the film worked, it was going to have a chance to flourish. And of course, that's exactly what happened. But it was never a slam dunk. There's always a great deal of uncertainty going into this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the old saying is if you knew what goes into making a hit, then everyone would do it, and there'd be nothing but hits out there.
I guess, or there'd be nothing but the same movie.
Right.
But I think, when it wasn't so much when Steven saw the whole movie as when he saw, I showed him about 35 minutes of the film, and he came out, and, his praise was really off the scale, and it was really, such a great moment for me as a filmmaker to be praised by, Steven, who's the best. Absolutely, and a guy that inspired me to want to be a director. I don't want to make him feel old. People say that to me all the time, and it's like, oh man, But it's only probably an 8 or 10 year gap, really, from when he was doing some of his early big films and when I jumped into it.
Right. Now, were you ever concerned about, because the 3D that's in this film, and I'm not going to dwell on the technology for long, but I wanted to ask about the 3D in this film. Were you ever concerned about the audience's threshold for watching a film that's a bit longer than some of the other 3D films and a bit more intense?
Absolutely. It was a concern. I mean, there was no data on that, there'd been a few 3D hits out there, Ice Age and Monsters vs. Aliens and so on, and they were relatively short films, under 100 minutes. And here we were putting out a film that's 2 hours and 42 minutes. But I was aware of that from the get-go as a possibility, as a possible problem. So we were pretty conservative in the 3D. We weren't constantly trying to rip your eyes out of your head.
Richard Crouse.